Last night I spoke about my personal sense um, that I would like to see a conservatism that's more nationalist, more Burkean in foreign policy, and more religious. What I want to address this morning, my particular focus now, will be the nationalist aspect. What does a more nationalist conservatism look like? Can it be done? Has it been done? Should it be done? I want to start, though, by talking about nationalism because it's such a poorly defined word. And it's one that the enemies of nationalism are trying so desperately to marginalize. You do not hear the word nationalism mentioned without some sort of a prefix, right? Ethnic nationalism, white nationalism. Nationalism is none of those things, need not be any of those things. And just to go back in history a little bit to sort of vindicate the term, by most accounts, the founder of modern nationalism was a German thinker, Herder. And Herder was, in a sense, obsessed with race, right? This guy thought a lot about race to the extent that he denied there was such a thing as race. He had big debates with his teacher Kant. Kant had these race-based theories of the world, and Herder, the founder of nationalism, said there's no such thing as race. He has this beautiful quote. 1784, he wrote, "There are neither 4 nor 5 races, nor are there exclusive varieties on earth. The colors run into one another." It's like a Benetton commercial in 1784. Same year, he called Africans and Native Americans our brothers. You have to understand how revolutionary this was in that day and age. Now, Herder didn't reject the racial divisions of mankind to embrace some sort of universalism. He believed in divisions of mankind, not into races, but into nations. But his sense of nationalism was actually quite a beautiful nationalism. He had this vision that each nation on its own developed its unique national spirit, what he called the Volksgeist. And he saw this process of developing national spirit as the engine that would drive human progress. This is how great ideas and great institutions are developed that ultimately enrich all of humanity. And he said, while each of us is divided by nation, there is no ranking of nations. Each nation can develop something to contribute to the world. So, under this view, this original view, the view that I think we should reclaim, nationalism is nothing more than the love of one's own people, one's own institutions, one's own culture, and the belief that an individual can make his greatest contributions to humanity by making his contributions to his nation. That's all it is and need be. No need to add some of the adjectives, some of the prefixes. So that's my sense of nationalism. Is nationalism conservative? Well, as conservatives, and we're going to be talking more about this, we believe in our core foundational texts. We have reverence for the foundational texts of our civilization, starting with the Bible. Especially the Hebrew Bible, I see as very much a book that embraces this sense of nationalism. In a sense, that was God's plan for humanity. I'm going to pick one people, Israel, and through them model how to live a good life, how to live a righteous life. And by this nation modeling this, if you will, Volksgeist, all of humanity will be elevated. So yeah, in a sense, the Bible, in this form, in this definition, is a very nationalist book. Skipping forward a little bit, we get to a guy named Burke. I'm sure all of you know this quote, but it bears repeating in this context from Reflections on the Revolution in France. To be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong to in society is the first principle, the germ as it were, of public affections. It is the first link in a series by which we proceed towards a love to our country and to mankind. So again, by loving our unit, our family, our nation, this is actually how we proceed to a greater love of humanity. But it's through the smaller divisions, through our nation. Burke very much embraced this sense of nationalism. You look at Abraham Lincoln, not necessarily as a conservative, but as someone who defined the American mission in the world. Someone who really defined what our republic stands for in the world. And he took what I believe is this view of nationalism in his Gettysburg Address. Why must America survive? Why must America stay united? Simple reason. We have a national mission. And that mission is so that government of the people, for the people, by the people, shall not perish from the earth. He saw that as our national mission, and one that was important not just to us, but to the earth. And then, of course, no talk about conservatism is complete without mentioning Ronald Reagan. But what was the idea of the shining city on a hill? It's shining. It's an example. It's biblical. Through what we do in America, what we do in this nation, we elevate the world. There's a final aspect of nationalism that gets less attention. And it's what I want to focus on for a little bit. When we talk about nationalism in this context, we're talking about looking outward, what we can do for the world, what we can model for the world. But nationalism also has to look inward. Right? It's about developing that Volksgeist, developing that national spirit. And it's about embracing our nation as one of these concentric circles. Family and nation, which implies reciprocal obligation, implies love. But it implies that perhaps we have obligations towards others in our nation, and they have obligations towards us, so that together we can build a nation that can model whatever our national imagination and national character can do for the world. And the thinker and the person that did the most to develop this aspect of nationalism, and the thinker and the person who did the most, I think, to develop a conservatism married to nationalism and religion that can be extraordinarily instructive to us at this juncture in history, was one of my heroes, Benjamin Disraeli. I think if you grow up as a Jew in the conservative world, you automatically gravitate to Benjamin Disraeli. But what he did, of course, is truly extraordinary. He saw a Tory party, a conservative party, doomed to failure. When you're the party of the wealthy landowners, and they're increasing the franchise and giving the vote to increasingly large swaths of people who are not wealthy landowners, the future is not bright. And so for both reasons of political imperative, but I also think moral imperative, he imagined and created a conservatism that went beyond this wealthy landowning class and embraced the working class in a rapidly industrializing Britain. And through his novels, he put forth a compelling vision, a vision that would appeal to this working class and turn them into conservatives, and a vision that would make conservatives recognize that this working class, in their terrible, horrible homes and communities, were actually part of their country to whom they owed an obligation. And Disraeli did this best and most famously in his book Sybil, a novel. Rusty and I were talking about this. It's a novel Rusty very much enjoyed. I can't recommend it. But as a novel, as a work of politics, though, it's genius. And so I just want to share, of course, a famous passage from Sybil, where it's the first novel, really, where someone from the upper crust in England wrote about the terrible conditions of the working class in Britain. And so in Sybil, we have the young hero talking about how the Queen of England reigns over the greatest nation on earth, Britain. And the working class hero in Sybil, he's a working class hero, responds that the Queen of England reigns over two nations. And here's the famous quote: She reigns over 2 nations between whom there is no intercourse and no sympathy, who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts, and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets, who are formed by different breeding, are fed by a different food, are ordered by different manners, and are not governed by the same laws. And then he reveals he's talking of 2 nations, the rich and the poor. When you hear that quote, it does put me in mind of the way that so many in the media have recently so desperately tried to understand the Trump voter and have made these pilgrimages to working class Rust Belt towns. Because this is a swath of America, a section of America with whom they have no intercourse, with whom they have nothing in common, of whom they have been completely and totally ignorant, and to whom they constantly condescend. And this divide between the 2 nations that Disraeli describes is very much accurate, not only for the divide between the landed wealthy and the working class of an industrializing Britain, it captures as well our elite, urban elites, the Sella corridor elites, and the divide between them and the working in a de-industrializing America. The divide's there, and therefore I think a conservatism that recognizes the divide and seeks to get beyond the divide and to bring the working class into our conservative party is actually a crucial imperative. So Sybil describes the misery of the working class in graphic detail. The hero discovers the pain of the working class and devotes himself to alleviating it. That's what the hero of the novel does, and that's what the author of the novel does. That's what Disraeli did. And what he proposed was an alliance between this aristocracy that he represented in the working class, and at the heart of the alliance would be the recognition that aristocracy has a responsibility to the working class. We talk about their needing to take responsibility. They need to be responsible for themselves. We also have a responsibility towards them, our fellow Englishmen, our fellow Americans. Disraeli tried to invoke greatness of the past. He called it chivalry, noblesse oblige, but it was responsibility. Disraeli wrote, a reconstructed Tory party would change the oligarchy back into a generous aristocracy. Well, wait a minute. If we're going to start caring about the working class, we're going to start trying to help those of our fellow Americans who are caught in these global economic shifts, isn't that going to make us liberal? I mean, aren't we going to start building them public housing and paying for their health care? Isn't this a dangerous path we've just embarked upon? I don't think so. And I think the way Disraeli did it perhaps can give us some examples of why it doesn't have to be. First of all, Disraeli proposed to bridge the gap with the working class and to help the working class by bringing religion. So first of all, he proposed to do this through religion. And again, to my mind, a renewed conservatism would be nationalist, religious, and Burkean. Disraeli's Tory party was one he proposed that religion be a central pillar. And he wrote repeatedly about this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now. Others will talk about the religious component of conservatism. But basically, he saw a reconstructed Tory party as one that would infuse life and vigor into the church, because the church is the trainer of the nation. He wrote in Coningsby, another novel that I can't recommend. The church is the medium by which by which the despised and the degraded classes assert their native equality of man and vindicate the rights of power and intellect. It is through the church we regenerate the national character. There's a lot here, but basically the church comes against utilitarianism, comes against the sort of the mercantile ideology, and reminds us all that we love our neighbor as ourselves. He also sought to help the working class through legislation. But here's, on the whole, The legislation that Disraeli supported was legislation that enabled the working class to be more self-reliant, not dependent on the state. And there are important distinctions here that, if we focus more on what policies you can embrace to embrace the working class, there's a lot to develop here. But for example, he supported the Employees and Workmen Act of 1875. It gave workers the right to sue their employers if their employers violated contracts. That's not a social program. The Conspiracy and Protection of Property Act enshrined the right to strike. Reform Act of 1867 gave the vote. So he did it by means of religion. He did it by means of policy. But most importantly, and this, I want to focus my remaining time on this, he did it through imagination. Disraeli recognized, and I think we need to recognize, to a certain extent Donald Trump recognized, the working class is interested in issues that transcend their pocketbook. They, like all of us, have existential needs and desires. They're not just economic actors. And the way conservatives can capture the imagination of the nation, the way conservatives can capture the imagination of the working class, is by offering the opportunity to be part of a great empire, in the case of Britain, or a great nation in the case of the United States. This isn't liberal. This isn't revolutionary. It's the opposite. Disraeli spoke of restoration, not revolution. He stressed that we can capture the imagination of the country by use of ancient forms and the restoration of the past, not by political revolution founded on abstract ideas. And here's the final point I want to make. What he saw, what Donald Trump saw, was that the working class, especially those suffering not because of any personal failure, but because of larger dislocations, because their community is going down. When you work in a steel town that's not making steel anymore, a town that's sinking like a stone, it's hard to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But he saw, and I think Donald Trump saw, that these people very often are our natural allies. They share our values to a considerable extent. These are people who love God. They love their families. They love the United States of America and aren't ashamed of it. And they actually love opportunity and hard work and are desperate for the opportunity to work hard. They share our values. And an alliance in the day of Disraeli brought the working class and the aristocracy together against the Whigs, against the middle class, against the factory owners. Today, an alliance between conservatives and the working class can together focus on what we share against an urban elite, an academic elite, a media elite, which despises them and despises us fairly much equally. But the potential for an alliance is there, and the potential is strong. And this would have sounded wildly theoretic a year ago. But today, all of a sudden, it's become quite obvious. So, there's a saying I like, which is appropriate at times like this. Don't know who it came from. He said, "I must hurry, for they have gone, and I am their leader." They've gone. Say what you will about Donald Trump. He recognized something. And a lot of those that a lot of us would presume to lead have gone. And they've followed him. And they have followed him because he spoke to their imagination. He spoke to them with respect. He recognized that so much of the suffering in America today is not due to laziness. It's not due to a lack of personal responsibility. It's due to larger forces. And if we want to do better, those of us who don't appreciate Trump or feel he doesn't have a sufficient grasp of policy or sufficient depth of intellect, if we want to do better, we have to realize something. They have gone. They have followed him. And that's where I think if we have a role to play as conservatives today, it is that to have the humility to recognize the extent to which our movement has been blind to some of the pain of our fellow Americans. It's to have the humility to recognize the hubris with which so many of us view and speak about so many of those suffering in America today. And to repair those deficiencies in our movement in a way that Disraeli did, in a way that Trump did. But maybe if we wake up to this challenge, maybe if we wake up to our shortcomings, maybe if we wake up to what our hubris has blinded us to, we can get to the business of providing conservatives some of the depth and some of the thought and some of the policy heft that this new nationalist conservatism currently lacks. If we want to do better than Trump, let's learn from him and then go ahead and try to provide some of what he may indeed lack. But there's a lesson here. So a conservatism that's more nationalist, I think by reclaiming the word nationalism and looking back to conservative history. I mean, conservatives, we're supposed to revere history, revere the roots of our civilization, the roots of our republic. We're allowed to look at conservatism that preceded Ronald Reagan. And if we do it and look back to the likes of Burke and the likes of Disraeli and learn the lessons of Trump, I think there's an opportunity here to create a conservatism that is more relevant and more capable of winning majorities than what our movement has accomplished to date. Thank you.